She is my grandmother-in-law. So I'm going to kind of just hang out up here with her. A lot of you submitted questions yesterday. Some of those have been chosen. Obviously, with 43 minutes, we have X amount of time. So there are about a dozen questions here. And if we have time, we'll do some follow-up at the end. Okay, so again, thank you for coming. I call her Mary Bell, but for the purposes of professionalism, I will call her Mrs. Miller, which is very strange for me to do. So I guess our first question is, and this comes from Sam, do you remember where you were when Pearl Harbor was attacked, and what were your initial thoughts when that news got to you?
Yes, I remember. I was home. It was a Sunday, and we went to church that morning, and my brother had just left for California. He graduated from Oberlin College, and he was going to live out there and work. And of course, we were nervous wrecks because that was happening out there on the West Coast. And there was the concern that it might come onto the coast at that time, that it wouldn't just stay in Hawaii. And it was something that happened, but it didn't sink in like it should have because no one expected it or had any connection with war at that time. We were pretty naive, and so what we did more was worry about my brother and knew what was happening, hearing it on the radio, certainly not television because that was long in the future. But it was something that in a town like Amherst, about 3,500 people, you just didn't think about wars or ever believe that you would ever be involved in anything that had to do with war.
Mm-hmm. Now, I want to preface this next question by saying I may have misspoken a little bit when I talked about her father, Mr. Powers, working at U.S. Automatic during the war. Typically, from what I was corrected, those hours were typically during the summer. However, keep in mind, while we as teachers enjoy our summers off, superintendents do not. Okay, they work all year long. So the question does become, how did you feel seeing how many hours that your father, Fred Powers, put in during the war between his work running this entire school district and overnight shift at U.S. Automatic? And you can see him up here.
Well, I was very proud of him, and he had really many reasons for doing this. One of the reasons would be all the kids that were had gone to school in Amherst over his years that he had been there and would be later on, because he wanted to support those kids. Some girls that excuse me, I'm going to say girls and boys. You have to get used to that. That's my language at the time. The women, well, I could say the women started joining the armed forces, but my dad lost his brother after World War I was over, who was a doctor in Russia, and it was kind of a Dr. Zhivago story that he was working in a makeshift hospital surgery room or unit to operate on some soldier who had been wounded in northern Russia in the winter, and a shell fragment hit him, and because of it, he died. And my dad really he was the youngest member of the family, my uncle was. And Dad, I know, was thinking of my uncle, but he was thinking of all the kids that were in school. They were in school right at the time. It would be called into the armed forces, and he wanted to do whatever he could do to help this war get over. And I think he did work like Christmas vacation, spring vacation, but he was a very dedicated person. He was quiet, but he was determined, and I was proud of him, very proud of him. And he saw it as a privilege.
As I think most did, which is just speaks to the volume of dedication to the country during this time. To follow up on that, could you, if you know, explain what exactly he did? What can we see him doing in this photo?
Well, he's working in a tool, they call a tool room, and they make tools. And it's a, Norm, could you say that?
Tool and die maker. It was for production. He would make the cutting tools, or he would make the parts to the machine that would make the artillery shell parts, or make the parts for the Norton bomb site, or whatever other contracts that U.S. Automatics, the Nord family, had for the war effort.
Thanks. Okay. And actually this summer, I worked at U.S. Automatic in the inspection room, and I had to inspect something that went into something in the shells, which I didn't know what part of the shell it went into, but I knew I had to be careful and do the job right.
And for those of you that don't know, U.S. Automatic is Nordson, which is just over that bridge on Jackson Street, so it's right here in town. What did you think of FDR, and was there a general consensus about FDR within the Amherst community?
Yes, because he was a wartime president. He was very capable. He was very attentive. He himself was a Navy veteran. And at that time, we had no idea that he had polio and was in a wheelchair. All the time that I was in high school, I don't think I ever realized that he was in a wheelchair in order to get around. And when I started school, he went into office. The year I graduated, he was still in it. He was in for 12 years. And when I was at BW, that summer is when he died. But he was a very, very dedicated, extremely dedicated to the armed forces and to the people. And he would have what they call fireside chats. And he would talk like we're talking right now about what was going on with the war, what he hoped would happen, and try to encourage the people to be able to wait it out, because it was gonna turn out fine. But we had a lot of work to do, and he was a working president, even though he really was handicapped.
Now, and this photo was actually taken from one of the fireside chats. I mean, he wasn't necessarily sitting next to a fire and reading a storybook, okay? It's not, 'twas the night before Christmas. But these fireside chats would take place over the radio. Obviously, he couldn't tweet, he couldn't, send press releases out, so he did this over the radio. Now, you mentioned these hardworking and dedicated armed forces. Did people seem to approve of him overwhelmingly?
Yes, and another thing he did, he got people working, like they called it WPA, and they had different, I believe it was AA. He had, was kind of like a camp. It was a work camp that people would go and attend, because he was dealing with the tail end of the Depression too. So he just had his hands full. But he was the president, and believe me, things were a little different as to our respect for the president. Whether you happened to vote for him, if you were a Republican or a Democrat, he was the president. He got respect because he commanded respect because of his own behavior and his attitude. But things were a little different in that way too. I don't think that one would ever do anything to condemn him, especially in time of war, in a way that would be disrespectful. And I think it was a good way to be.
Can you share a little about your feelings when your brother was shipped off to war? And that's on the right of the picture is her brother, Harry Powers, and her dad, Fred Powers. That was at the Powers School dedication across the street.
Yes, once again, it just didn't seem that life was going to be that way. And once again, we were pretty innocent. We thought we didn't know what the heck was really going on. But we knew that my brother ended up going to the South Pacific, and he was in one of the bloodiest wars in at that time. And I don't think he ever carried a gun when he was a kid. But he went in that war and it got marksmanship awards and was in a very, very bloody war. But when he came back, he didn't talk about it. People didn't that much. They just kept everything kind of under wraps. And he'd been there, he'd been in the war. Of course, we worried. We wrote him letters, sent him things in the mail that he could enjoy if he got them. And it's just, and then everyone had like a little banner in their window if someone was in the armed forces. If you were just in the armed forces, your star was blue. If you were killed in the war, if one of your family members were killed, then you would have a gold star in your window. And parents got a gold star for the loss of their child. And nobody wanted to see a gold star when you go by houses. The town was full of stars, blue stars, and you hope very few gold stars.
You had mentioned that he didn't talk about it much when he came back. Harry passed away, what year?
About 80s, in the 80s, early 80s.
No, Fred did
Fred was 80s.
90s, I'm sorry, yeah.
Did he ever talk about it, ever? Did you ever have a conversation about his experiences, or was it pretty much from when he returned until he passed that he just didn't talk about it? And why?
Well, interestingly enough, after he was done with the tour that he had in Japan, when in the islands, he was sent to Japan in the Army of Occupation, and he really liked Japan. He this is what is so weird, it's so horrible about a war. You could go into a country where there's been all kinds of the worst type of fighting anybody could get involved in, and find out the people there are really quite nice and you really can get along. But he was in Japan for a while. But now where am I going with that?
You tell me.
Army of Occupation.
Okay, so he was in the Army of Occupation for a while, but he would tell things that were interesting about the Japanese people. He would tell things that were maybe funny about the war, like one of his buddies' name was Milton Utz. Milton Utz is kind of a funny name, but Milton went walking one night and he fell over somebody, and the person he fell over started speaking Japanese. So Milton went back to where he was real fast. But things did happen that were so unreal, that people who just lived a life of comfort all at once would be on a desert island and walking around in the neighborhood of the enemy and having possibly to get up and start defending your life. It's not the best way to live.
That's what we call a real problem, not a, we have these first world problems where our Wi-Fi goes out, or, we're tweeting to Mr. Sayers that school's not called off and there's an inch of snow out. We should not have school. We don't have to worry about, bullets grazing our head or shrapnel entering our throat. I mean, these are real.
Or no
real
food,
problems.
no food,
Yeah.
no water, no medical attention. There's a lot of just so many things that you would never think about.
We take it for granted. speaking of the Japanese, you said that your brother said, you know, they really were just lovely people. But in the community, did you see a general disdain for the Japanese and Germans? And
Oh,
if
yes.
so, do you think that propaganda contributed to it? Not necessarily this piece of propaganda, but, I mean, obviously you saw much more than we did. You know, was there that general disdain?
Is what is the definition of propaganda as far as the class is concerned?
This, posters, exaggerated caricatures, with exaggerated features, you know.
Yes.
I don't want to say bordering racist, you know, images, racist images, because they were.
They were definitely, I mean, you hated the people, there's no two ways about it, because they were shooting your relatives and the people you loved and doing things that were certainly not something that you want to see happen. But they were doing their work, they were doing their job, and we were doing ours. But at the time, the worst picture they could make of anyone who was Asian, Japanese, were pretty sad. And then I mean, they were bad. They were bad. And Hitler, of course, was, they made a movie about, Charlie Chaplin played that part. I mean, they had some songs, In the Führer's Face was one song, and it was done like a German band. And they'd say like, Oompa, Oompa, in the Führer's face. It was a funny song, but it wasn't funny. But it made you hate. And that's what the whole purpose was, to make you hate. And that's not good. It's just not good. But that's the way life is, apparently. And when I did a stuttering here in a minute. When I was at BW, my two next door roommates were Japanese, and they lived on the West Coast. Their parents were in an occupation camp. Their brothers and their boyfriends were in the Army. Now figure that out. That was, in Baldwin Wallace was one of the colleges that did take Japanese students at the time during the war. It was still during the war, because a lot of colleges would not take the students. Now that didn't seem to happen with the Germans, but it did happen with the Japanese.
So I just want to make sure that I'm clear on this. Families were in the internment camps, but members of the same families were fighting as American soldiers.
Yes, probably in the European theater.
Something to think about, isn't it? I mean, it'd be like me being put in an internment camp, kept away from my family and society, and my brother fighting for the country that has secluded me.
Mm-hmm.
Something to kind of mull over. I can't fathom that. As you were a student at Central School up by the fire station, as all grades were there at this time, did you have to practice any certain drills during school in the event of an attack?
Well, you know, I don't think we ever got underneath a desk. I really don't. I know.
Cover
No, we did that when I was in elementary school here.
when you taught,
No,
or when you
when
were
I was
a
at,
student? Okay.
and no, yeah, when I taught, because when we were students, for some reason, we never got involved in that. We you did have air raid drills, because someone would knock on your door and say, turn out your lights. So every light had to be turned out in your house, shades down if somebody was sick and had to have light in the house. But that was done by the air raid warden. The local air raid warden took care of that. And that was pretty interesting. I mean, the kindergartners always wanted to hear about that. They thought that was great. They have to turn all your lights out and somebody come around, knock on the door and tell you that. But you sat in the dark for a while, and then the siren would go on, and then you'd Now that was done in the town.
Okay. Interesting. What did you specifically do to help the war effort? Did you feel a special sense of pride in doing what it was that you did? And did everybody feel that same sense of pride?
I think everybody did. I'm sure everybody did. And one of the biggest things you did, the most important would be to conserve. You conserved food. Food was rationed, of course, and you were careful. We had about 50 recipes for hamburg at my house, at my folks' house, and the food that you got was what you ate, because the food, everything that was grown or produced for strength and vitality and whatever, for health, would go to the war. And of course, gasoline was something else. You had a stamp for gasoline. It was A, B, or C. And C was the most gas that you could be rationed. But if your ration stamp, your book of stamps was gone, you didn't get any gasoline unless you had a friend who was a farmer. Now, we kids had a lot of kids in our class who were, their families were farmers. And every now and then we'd pay a little visit to the farmer, and the farmer's kid would get over by the gas tank and get a little bit of gasoline in your car, and then you go for a ride. But you really felt that you were doing a favor, and you were, by conserving and keeping things that were needed for the war. Now, Lucky Strike's green went to war. Lucky Strike cigarettes used to be in a green package. They changed it to white, and that green dye that they used for that cigarette package went to war. It would have been used for dyeing certain things. Yeah. For uniform
Camouflage.
colors.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
But that was, Lucky Strike bragged about that. They did that.
Did not know that. In what ways were women in Amherst able to contribute? We've talked about that in class, how the boys went off to work, or went off to war, and women went into the workplace.
Well,
how were
that's-
they able to do that around here? What was it like for them?
Well, that's where Rosie the Riveter came. She was she took off her apron and put on her, well, what do you call them, coveralls, put a bandana around her head so she didn't get her hair caught in a machine, and went to war. And that really was a big change for women, because Rosie found out she could go to work in the factory, she could come home and still make cookies, take care of the kids, cook the meals. And women's liberation, I think, got a good start right on for that reason, that women found out that they had a place other than the household, plus the fact that they also had to accept the fact that when the men came back, they were supposed to be guaranteed a job that the women had, but that wasn't always the case, because things didn't go so well that way either, because the jobs weren't guaranteed like they should have been, and that was heartache for a lot of people.
You mean the jobs were guaranteed back to the men? Is that, I just want to make sure I'm clear on.
Yes.
Okay.
And they weren't always able to get the job, and that was sad, because that caused naturally a lot of problem, because they had families to take care of when they got back. And another thing I think that we slipped up on, we weren't that aware, because unless you're in a situation like a person in a wartime, you don't realize sometimes that it's not easy to come back home and go sit in your chair again and be able to communicate and feel about anything like you felt before you left because of what you'd been through. And we just kind of expected everybody to come back home and everything would be hunky-dory because they're back home. And that was difficult, and I think we have a better understanding of that now. I hope so. I mean, in Vietnam, that showed up very bad. But it's a heck of a life to live. And it's something that we have to be aware of and think about when we're dealing with folks who have been in the armed forces coming home and trying to get back to whatever normal is.
Do you feel that the government was good to our soldiers when they came back? Were they taken care of in any way?
I don't think they were special. Well, just things like that, because for some reason that awareness wasn't there yet. I know, well, when Norm came back from the Navy over here, he had a garage that he opened up for business, and he wanted to put a sign out in front of the garage to say opening day for the garage. Amherst wouldn't let him put that sign out because it was against the one of their ordinances.
Is this why you ran for council?
No, I was already on
Oh,
council.
okay.
But there you go. I mean, somebody who'd been in the Navy for 4 years, come back home, want to put a sign in the front of his garage that the garage is opening that day, and wasn't allowed. So I think that kind of says, and that was not too long ago if you think of time compared to World War II.
We have a question from the boy in the corner. If
Okay.
you want to take that question.
GI Bill of Rights. Tell about the GI Bill of Rights for the guys, boys that came home from the war. What did the GI Bill of Rights guarantee them?
Well, that should have guaranteed you medical, some type of a pension.
Education?
Yes, you could go to college if you were in the service for 4 years. You could get 4 years of college or 2 years, and that was supposedly paid for. And it was something that wasn't always abided by or paid attention to, and it's once again something that you slip up on, and it's so easy to be patriotic and wave your flag and pledge allegiance and do all these things, but then when it comes to the actual
Doing.
rubber hitting the road, it doesn't happen.
I know we've touched on this a little bit, but how would you describe the attitudes of those around you during the war? And did you recognize a significant difference between the attitudes of the youth versus those of the adults in the school setting, in the community?
Well, you know what? We didn't pay that much attention to the adults. We paid attention to each other. But with the kids, we were collecting metal. I mean, there's a picture, I think in that yearbook, of the football. Some of the kids still in football uniform, piling metal onto some place they were collecting, because all that was used in the war, and it was something that, by conserving things and saving things that could be turned in and used for anything that would be transposed into something that was usable. We rolled bandages for people for last minute or first minute attention that somebody would need. We had what they called was a canteen, where it was down in Lorraine, and you had a place where you could, the armed forces come to Lorraine. For some reason, they might come on the lake, or they might come through recruiting, that they would have dances and they would have food for if you were in the armed forces, and you could be entertained in that way.
I pulled up the yearbook because you had mentioned the scrap and the metal. Mr. Miller, can you remember off the top of your head? We had found that figure, and it was a lot of metal that was collected. I mean, it was many tons, I feel. Yeah, and I just tried one of them. It wasn't in that one. But it was many tons. I want to say it was like 10,000 pounds or 50,000 pounds, some astronomical number that really demonstrated, even right here in the community, the effort that was put in. This is the last question that I have on here. We'll have time for follow-up questions or curiosities that people may have. But how did you adjust back to normal life after the war?
Well, for one thing, you had to adjust to the fact that the guys were back. That wasn't hard. That's supposed to be funny.
I laughed.
That was great, and it was, once again, I was in college then, and I was having enough trouble adjusting to not being homesick at that particular time. Then, but everybody just kind of did adjust. I mean, because that's what you do. You go one day at a time, and you whatever you're presented that day, you go along with. But once again, we adjusted to them coming back. How they adjusted to coming back was another story. And like I say, I'm sorry that we weren't more aware of that and into that at the time. But it surely was nice.
You talk about adjusting to guys coming back, and one thing that I don't think we touched on, and I hope I'm not getting too personal, but a Mr. Parker Miller came back. You want to discuss who he was, how he went into the war, anything about that? And if not, totally okay.
Well, Mr. Parker Miller was not 16 years old when he went to the Navy. He went someplace in Amherst, and somebody changed the date on his birth certificate and made him 16 sooner by taking off a 1 that should have been on an 11, which they probably could have gotten in trouble for, but nobody said anything. He went to the Navy and was on a PT boat, which was very difficult at that time because you have to have perfect balance to be on a PT boat, which he obviously had, because they were zipping and zooming around all over the place in between battleships, and they're very active and very important in a war. They also would pick up people who were wounded in the water way into the ocean, and they had a big assignment. And then I married him, and he's one of the kids over there. But then I divorced him later because he became a registered nurse. He was a very capable young man when he was 15 years old in the Navy, which I think was too young to go into the Navy to that type of life. But he.
Can any of you imagine? I mean, people today get fake IDs for other reasons, for purchasing power, should you say? Can you imagine going out of your way to get a fake ID to go possibly die? It got really quiet when I said that. It's significant. I did not realize we have about 1 minute before the bell rings.
I just want to say, when I was in high school, I was your age when the war broke out. I was a sophomore. We were in the study hall at Central School, we all gathered in there from the high school. We could all get in there. And the President Roosevelt's speech about the fact that we were now in the war came across the radio, and there we sat. Our lives changed that day, and they changed for a lot of people, and we learned a few good things from the war, like penicillin, a few things that we did learn, but heaven help us if we get into another one. And I will tell you something else. I'm 91 years old. When I sat around, it was fun in our class to slump. Don't slump. Because when you get older, you're going to have a back that doesn't straighten up.
Wait,
So remember that.
wait, sit. We can get up here all day and blab to you about what we have been taught. But Mr. Millen, Mrs. Marty, Mrs. Opel, none of the teachers here have had this experience. I hope you really can appreciate what you just experienced. For me, it was awesome. And I know this woman dearly. She is my wife's grandmother. But this was awesome for me. Please show her your gratitude for spending her time here today.